A very good morning to all of you once again. Lovely to be with you. And can't believe, I'm sure as you cannot, that Christmas is 2 weeks away. The passage which we're going to deal with today gives us something of an indication of what God had in mind all the way back in the Old Testament. In fact, in 2 Chronicles 2, concerning the king who would be coming to this earth to rule forever. And so could you turn to 2 Chronicles 2, verses 5 and 6. 2 Chronicles 2, verses 5 and 6. This past week I posted as the verse of the day that passage, 2 Chronicles 2, verse 5 and 6, which says, Solomon speaking, "The temple I am going to build will be great, because our God is greater than all other gods. But who is able to build a temple for him, since the heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain him? Who then am I to build a temple for him, except as a place to burn sacrifices before him?" I was so utterly blown away as I looked into the meaning of this text that I felt very, very strongly led to expand on my initial thoughts in this sermon. Now, just to orientate ourselves, we need to know that this passage forms part of a letter which King Solomon of Israel wrote to King Hiram of Tyre, that is Lebanon, in which he asked Hiram to send him all manner of building materials to build the temple in Jerusalem where God would be worshipped forever. In these 2 verses, Solomon tells Hiram that the temple that he was going to build would be of unprecedented magnificence when compared to all existing temples in the ancient world. Even as he was writing this letter, however, these 2 verses indicate that Solomon realized that the magnificence of the temple would be utterly eclipsed by the majesty of God. The magnificence of the temple would be utterly eclipsed by the majesty of God, for whom it was being built. As splendid as the temple of Yahweh would be, it would be quite pathetic and inadequate to do Yahweh, God of Israel, any justice. The first aspect concerning the temple details the splendor of the temple, the splendor of the temple. Solomon says in verse 5, "The temple that I'm going to build will be great, because our God is greater." Concerning this temple, we need to take into account firstly the history of the temple. The history of the temple. We're all well aware, I'm sure, that when God had delivered his people from slavery in Egypt, he gave them the 10 Commandments as the basis for his covenant with his people Israel. Then he told them to build the tabernacle, a very elaborate tent which would house the most sacred object in all of Judaism, and that is the Ark of the Covenant, which was a golden box totally overlaid with gold and decorated with 2 heavenly creatures called cherubim, whose golden wings would form a kind of canopy over the ark to mark the very place where God would appear to his people from what is known as the mercy seat. God went to great lengths to actually provide the plans for how the tabernacle was to be constructed. That tent or tabernacle, with its sacred cargo, the Ark of the Covenant, would travel ahead of Israel, indicating both God's presence and direction to reassure his people as he led them towards the promised land. Now, fast forward 500 odd years, and Israel was safely in the promised land, and King David was on the throne of Israel. And one day, as recorded in 1 Chronicles 17:1, David said to the prophet Nathan, "Here I am living in a palace of cedar, while the ark of the covenant of the Lord is under a tent." David saw the massive anomaly here. He was living in a palace, and God was living in a tent. So Nathan effectively says to David, well, if you have it in mind to build a temple for God. God's response was actually extraordinary. He appeared to Nathan in a dream and told him, "Go to my servant David and say, you are not the one to build me a house to dwell in. I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought Israel up out of Egypt to this day. I have moved from one tent site to another, from one dwelling place to another. Wherever I have moved with all of the Israelites, did I ever say to the leaders who I commanded to shepherd my people, why have you not built me a house of cedar?" God had never ever asked for or commanded of Israel that they build a temple for him. Why not? Because God knew that Israel would soon worship that temple and not the God of the temple, which is precisely what happened time and time and time again. That is also why there is no record that I can find in the Old Testament of God commanding a temple be built for him. However, it would appear in 1 Chronicles chapter 28 and verse 19 that God did give David the plans for the temple, and he instructed his son Solomon, who would build the temple. He said he had to do it precisely as God had said, because every part of this plan was given to me, David, in writing from the hand of the Lord. So, no command from God to build a temple, but it appears that God did provide the blueprint or the plans. Instead, what God told Nathan to tell David was this: "I declare to you, David, that the Lord will build a house for you." He then goes on to say that David's son Solomon would build it, and I will establish his throne forever. I will set him over my house and my kingdom forever. His throne will be established forever. In saying this, God was pointing to the fact that he would perpetuate David and Solomon's line to the point where an eternal king would rule over God's kingdom and would reign forever over all the earth. This is clearly a prophecy about Jesus Christ, whom God would send to live amongst his people eternally and rule over them in righteousness. What God planned was Emmanuel, God with us in person, as opposed to God with us in a temple. Nevertheless, God graciously allowed the Jerusalem temple to be built by Solomon, and of that temple we learn, secondly, of the greatness of the temple, the greatness of that temple. Solomon wrote to Hiram, "The temple that I am going to build will be great." And that word great there is magnificent. And I've already pointed out that it means of unprecedented magnificence. That's what the word great means. Absolutely marvelous and splendid and outstanding. That temple would be like no other ever built in all the world. And Solomon was not exaggerating, because in chapter 3 we are told about the building of the temple, and I'm just going to read a few verses from the 3rd chapter of 2 Chronicles. "Then Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. The foundation Solomon laid for the building the temple was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, about 30 meters by 10 meters. He overlaid the inside with pure gold. He paneled the main hall with pine and covered it with fine gold, and decorated it with palm trees and chain designs. He adorned the temple with precious stones, and the gold he used was gold of Parvaim. He overlaid the ceiling beams, door frames, walls, and doors of the temple with gold, and he carved cherubim on the walls. He built the most holy place, its length corresponding to the width of the temple, 20 cubits long with 20 cubits wide. He overlaid the inside with 600 talents of fine gold. The gold nails weighed 50 shekels. He also overlaid the upper parts with gold. In the most holy place, he made a pair of sculpted cherubim and overlaid them with gold. We can glean something of the magnificence of the temple from that narrative. But we also need to know that the Holy of Holies alone, where the tabernacle of God's presence would be housed, a space of about 10 meters by 10 meters, that entire room was covered in gold, weighing 23 metric tons. Now, by my calculation, that's over 800,000 ounces of gold, which at today's price would have a value of $1.5 billion US. In total, David gave his entire fortune to this building fund, 112 tons of gold, and the leaders gave another 188 tons of gold. That's 300 tons of gold alone, valued at today's rate at 19 billion US. Just to put that in context, Buckingham Palace today is worth $7 billion. And that's quite apart from the silver, jewels, bronze, iron, and all the timber floated down the coast from Lebanon to Israel. There were 70,000 common laborers, 80,000 stonecutters, and 3,600 foremen, all of whom, incidentally, were non-Jews but living in Israel. In total, it took 7 years to build the temple in spite of all that labor. So when Solomon said, "The temple I am going to build will be great," he meant it. However, let us never ever lose sight of the fact that the splendor of the temple was gadol, that is great, because our God is gadol, as it were, greater than all other gods. And that leads to the second part of this text, which contrasts the splendor of the temple with the God of the temple, the God of the temple. Inevitably, we're shaking our heads at the splendor of a $20 billion building. But in terms of its worth, when contrasted to the magnificence of God, we might as well be talking about a grain of dust when compared to the God of the temple, about whom Solomon speaks of just two aspects here. Firstly, he talks about the greatness of God, God's greatness. Again, verse 5, because our God is greater than all other gods. The name God in the Hebrew is the name Elohim, and the word greater is gadol, unprecedented magnificence. To understand this more fully, we've got to go back to Solomon's day in order to realize something about the implication of our God being called Elohim. It was the first name God revealed himself to be in Genesis 1:1, being greater than all other gods. Just notice immediately that our God is greater than all other gods, whoever they might be. The text actually says, greater is our God than all gods individually and collectively.